Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 86. With our book today, a writer who has become, over the long course of time, a character in not only American letters, but a character who has managed to transcend American and global literature. He was an author, humorist, essayist, and overall, an unwise yet ambitious entrepreneur. Comedic awards are given to stand-up comedians in his name, and even book awards are handed out under his name. He would love all of that, by the way. We are considering our third entry into the genre of travelogues and travel writing by American writers. This genre includes Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which he covered in episode number 19, and Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck, which we covered in episode number 20, and Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway, which we covered in episode number 18. Today on the podcast, we are reading and considering the potential leadership lessons that can be gleaned from Mark Twain's great, funny, and timely Western travelogue, Roughing It. Leaders, make comic capital out of almost everything you see and hear. And so we open today with Chapter 1 of Roughing It by Mark Twain. My brother had just been appointed Secretary of Nevada Territory, an office of such majesty that it concentrated in itself the duties and dignities of Treasurer, Comptroller, Secretary of State, and Acting Governor in the Governor's absence. A salary of $1,800 a year and the title of Mr. Secretary gave to the great position an air of wild and imposing grandeur. I was young and ignorant, and I envied my brother. I coveted his distinction and his financial splendor, but particularly and especially the long, strange journey he was going to make and the curious new world he was going to explore. He was going to travel. I never had been away from home, and that word travel had a seductive charm for me. Pretty soon he would be hundreds and hundreds of miles away, on the great plains and deserts, and among the mountains of the far west, and would see buffaloes and Indians and prairie dogs and antelopes and have all kinds of adventures, and maybe get hanged or scalped and have ever such a fine time and write home and tell us all about it and be a hero. And he would see the gold mines and the silver mines and maybe go out about of an afternoon when his work was done and pick up 2 or 3 pailfuls of shining slugs and nuggets of gold and silver on the hillside. And by he would become very rich and return home by sea and be able to talk as calmly about San Francisco and the ocean and the isthmus as if it was nothing of any consequence to have seen those marvels face to face. What I suffered in contemplating his happiness pen cannot describe, and so, when he offered me in cold blood the sublime position of private secretary under him, it appeared to me that the heavens and the earth passed away, and the firmament was rolled together as a scroll. I had nothing more to desire. My contentment was complete. At the end of an hour or 2, I was ready for the journey. Not much packing up was necessary because we were going in the overland stage from the Missouri frontier to Nevada, and the passengers were only allowed a small quantity of baggage apiece. There was no Pacific Railroad in those fine times of 10 or 12 years ago. Not a single rail of it. So let's open with a discussion of the literary life of Samuel Langhorn Clemens, a.k.a. Mark Twain. Now, Samuel Clemens, or Sam Langhorn Clemens, was born on November 30th, 1835, in Florida, Missouri. His life story and background is probably the most well-known of any man of letters, born and continuously active during almost the entirety of the long 19th century. Clemens was a noted writer, as I already mentioned before, humorist, essayist, a failed entrepreneur who went bankrupt at the end of his life, a publisher, and a worldwide lecturer. William Faulkner, another great man of American letters, called him, quote-unquote, the father of American literature. Clemens, like Edgar Allan Poe, is a writer who has become a person whose avatar has transcended American literature and has showed up in television shows, movies, all kinds of different media over the course of the last almost now 110 years since his death. He even infamously showed up in the 1990s in Star Trek. And, of course, he has been portrayed by actors like Val Kilmer in traveling shows across the Midwest. He was born shortly after an appearance of Halley's Comet and predicted that his death in 1910 would accompany it as well. And he did indeed die a day after the comet was at its closest to Earth, fulfilling his own prediction. Roughing It is a tale that is told through the lens of Mark Twain as a much older man, looking back with a wry sense of nostalgia at the vagaries of his youth. Part of it might be true, part of it might be false, but all of it's going to be entertaining. And Twain knew, unlike most leaders, that it's not so much how you tell the story, but it is about what you put in the story that matters for the listener, for the reader, and for your audience. Twain could hold an audience, whether in print or in person, and he would have loved podcasts like this one that we're doing today. Back to the book, back to Roughing It by Mark Twain. So we're going to pick up after he starts on his journey out west with his brother. We're going to pick it up in the back end of chapter 3. Now he's not chapter 3. I think we're going to pick up in the front end of chapter 4, where he is now in a stagecoach traveling across the great American West. And I quote, We jumped out in undress uniform. The driver tossed his gathered reins on the ground, gaped and stretched complacently, drew off his heavy buckskin gloves with great deliberation and insufferable dignity, taking not the slightest notion of a dozen solicitous inquiries after his health, and humbly facetious and flattering accostings and obsequious tenders of service from 5 or 6 hairy and half-civilized station-keepers and hostlers who were nimbly unhitching our steeds and bringing the fresh team out of the stables. For in the eyes of the stage driver of that day, station-keepers and hostlers were a sort of good-enough low creatures, useful in their place in helping to make up a world, but not the kind of beings which a person of distinction could afford to concern himself with. While, on the contrary, in the eyes of the station-keeper and the hostler, the stage driver was a hero, a great and shining dignitary, the world's favorite son, the envy of the people, the observed of the nations. When they spoke to him, they received his insolent silence meekly, and as being the natural and proper conduct of so great a man. When he opened his lips, they all hung on his words with admiration. He never honored a particular individual with a remark, but addressed it with broad generality to the horses, the stables, the surrounding country, and the human underlings. When he discharged a facetious, insulting personality at a hostler, that hostler was happy for the day. When he uttered his one jest, old as the hills, coarse, profane, witless, and inflicted on the same audience in the same language, every time his coach drove up there, the varlets roared and slapped their thighs and swore it was the best thing they'd ever heard in all their lives. By the way, pause. I love that word, varlets. Almost no one uses that anymore. Back to the book. And how they would fly around when he wanted a basin of water, a gourd of the same, or a light for his pipe. But they would instantly insult a passenger if he so far forgot himself as to crave a favor at their hands. They could do that sort of insolence as well as the driver they copied it from, for, let it be borne in mind, the overland driver had but little less contempt for his passengers than he had for his hostlers. For those of you who don't realize it, or who just stare at the continent of North America when you think about it at all on a globe or on a map, you don't really realize how big the United States actually is. And I've said this before on previous podcasts. I believe John Steinbeck mentioned this in Travels with Charlie back in the 1960s when he was traveling across the country, not via Conestoga wagon pulled by horses, but instead via car pulled by 400 horses, that the country is still a large one. And of course, he was correct. The material geographic fact of the largeness of the United States sometimes confounds people who don't really think about it. And by the way, it confounds even those of us who do think about it and who are in the United States. With this size comes a myth, a whole series of mythologizing, and we covered some of this last month when we talked with Tom Libby about Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, when we talked about James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, and of course when we talked about T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom. We also slightly touched on it in last couple of episodes ago, in My Antonia by Willa Cather. The type of writing, the type of literature that an American context engenders is the literature that requires myths to understand vast geographic distances. Russia has a similar challenge, and you see this in War and Peace, but you also see this in Dostoevsky's works, like the brothers Karamazov. Now, in our time, in our very, very postmodern era, where our myths are just as the sound of a fading wave rolling out to the distant sea, we no longer care about the traditions and myths of the past. We no longer value them enough to even make TikTok videos out of them. And because we don't value those myths anymore, we also don't value the confidence that came along with those myths. And so the death of the myth of the moral rightness of westward expansion has been fully completed in our time. And yet, people are still, in a post-pandemic environment, moving around. Works like Roughing It and other American-centric travel logs like Jack Kerouac's On the Road or Travels with Charlie that I already mentioned have become anachronisms almost. And that's weird in our time. It's a tension that we experience. These books have been supplanted in favor of international travel logs. I mean, look at the popularity of individuals like Anthony Bourdain, right, who will write a travel, or would, when he was alive, write a travel log of eating and visiting places. And I'm an Anthony Bourdain fan. Or individuals who will write about walking across the Middle East or Asia. But when was the last time you heard somebody walking across the United States of America? These things in our very postmodern future are more influenced by Edward Said than by Edmund Burke. That lack of spiritual mythology, that lack of spiritual mythologizing about the moral rightness of living in a country that spans geographically a third of a continent is yet another of the bleeding cuts in the body politic that are serving to bleed out and then infuse with other blood the body of the peoples of the United States of America. Samuel Langhorn Clemens, or Mark Twain, would hardly know what to do with such a change. He would be confounded and befuddled by it. He would probably make some jokes. Because sometimes one of the things that you can do in the face of postmodern change that seems to be rootless and make no sense, sometimes the best solution is not to adopt a sort of nihilistic absurdity like Albert Camus would recommend, or anybody else French would recommend, but instead to adopt a uniquely American solution. And that is to laugh. Laugh in the face of decline. Laugh joyfully in the face of cynicism. And to laugh as a coping mechanism, to use humor as a coping mechanism, not only to show that the emperor of postmodernism might be walking around naked, but laugh also in order to deal with the pain of the loss of the past. Back to the book, back to Roughing It by Mark Twain. So we're going to pick up in chapter 7, going a little bit further down the road. So now Samuel is in a wagon here, and he's approaching the shallow, yellow, muddy South Platte River. And, there's a little bit of a story here for you that he's going to relate that dovetails perfectly with what I was just saying about humor. Next morning, just before dawn, when about 550 miles from St. Joseph, our mud wagon broke down. We were to be delayed for 5 or 6 hours, and therefore we took our horses by invitation and joined a party who were just starting on a buffalo hunt. It was noble sport galloping over the plain in the dewy freshness of the morning. But our part of the hunt ended in disaster and disgrace, for a wounded buffalo bull chased the passenger Bemis nearly 2 miles, and then he forsook his horse and took to a lonely tree. He was very sullen about the matter for some 24 hours, but at last he began to soften little by little, and finally he said, "Well, it was not funny, and there was no sense in those gawks making themselves so facetious over it. I tell you I was angry in earnest for a while. I should have shot that long gangly lubber they called Hank, if I could have done it without crippling 6 or 7 other people, but of course I couldn't. The old Allens, so confounded comprehensive. I wish those loafers had been up in the tree. They would have wanted to laugh so. If I had had a horse worth a cent. But no, the minute he saw that buffalo bull wheel on him and give him a bellow, he raised straight up in the air and stood on his heels. The saddle began to slip, and I took him round the neck and laid close to him and began to pray. Then he came down and stood up on the other end a while, and the bull actually stopped pawing sand and bellowing to contemplate the inhuman spectacle. Then the bull made a pass at him and uttered a bellow that sounded perfectly frightful. It was so close to me, and that seemed to literally prostrate my horse's reason and make a raving, distracted maniac of him, and I wish I may die if he didn't stand on his head for a quarter of a minute and shed tears. He was absolutely out of his mind. He was, as sure as truth itself. He really didn't know what he was doing. Then the bull came charging at us, and my horse dropped down on all fours and took a fresh start, and then for the next 10 minutes we would actually throw one handspring up after another so fast that the bull began to get unsettled too and didn't know where to start in. And so he stood there sneezing and shoveling dust on his back and bellowing every now and then and thinking he got a $1,500 circus horse for breakfast certain. Well, I was first out on his neck, the horse's not the bull's, and then underneath and next on his rump, and sometimes head up, sometimes heels, but I tell you, it seems so solemn and awful to be ripping and tearing and carrying on so in the presence of death, as you might say. Pretty soon the bull made a snatch for us and brought away some of my horse's tail, I suppose, but do not know, being pretty busy at the time, but something made him get hungrier for solitude and suggested to him to get up and hunt for it. And then you ought to have seen that spider-leg old skeleton go, and you ought to have seen that bull cut out after him too. Head down, tongue out, tail up, bellowing like everything, and actually mowing down the weeds and tearing up the earth and boosting up the sand like a whirlwind. By George, it was a hot race. I and the saddle were back on the rump, and I had the bridle in my teeth and holding on to pommel with both hands. First, we left the dogs behind. Then we passed a jackass rabbit. Then we overtook a coyote, and we were gaining on an antelope when the rotten girth let go, and he threw me about 30 yards off to the left. And as the saddle went down over the horse's rump, he gave it a lift with his heels and sent him more than 400 yards up in the air. I wish I may die in a minute if he didn't. I fell at the foot of the only solitary tree there was in 9 counties adjacent, as any creature could see with the naked eye. And the next second I had hold of that bark with 4 sets of nails in my teeth, and the next second after that, I was a straddle of the main limb and blaspheming my luck in a way that made my breath smell of brimstone. I had the bull now if he did not think of one thing, by that one thing I dreaded. I dreaded it very seriously. There was a possibility that the bull might not think of it, but there were greater chances that he would. I made up my mind what I would do in case he did. I was a little over 40 feet to the ground from where I sat. I cautiously unwound the lariat from the pommel of my saddle. Your saddle? You take your saddle up in the tree with you? Take it up the tree with me? Why, how you talk? Of course I didn't. No man can do that. It fell in the tree when it came down. Oh, exactly. Certainly. I unwound the lariat and fastened one end of it onto the limb. It was the very best green rawhide and capable of sustaining tons. I made a slip noose in the other end and then hung it down to see the length. It reached down 22 feet, halfway to the ground. Then I loaded every barrel of the Allen with a double charge. I felt satisfied. I said to myself, if he never thinks of that one thing that I dread, all right. But if he does, all right anyhow, I am fixed for him. But don't you know what the very thing a man dreads is the thing that always happens? Indeed it is so. I watched the bull now with anxiety which no one can conceive of who has not been in such a situation and felt that at any moment death might come. Presently a thought came into the bull's eyes. I knew it, said I. If my nerve fails now, I am lost. Sure enough, it was just as I had dreaded. He started to climb the tree. What, the bull? Of course. Who else? But a bull can't climb a tree. He can't, can he? Since you know so much about it, did you ever see a bull try? No, I never dreamt of such a thing. Well, then what is your use of talking that way then? Because you never saw a thing done. Is that any reason why it can't be done? Well, all right, go on. What did you do? The bull started up and got along well for about 10 feet, then slipped and slid back. I breathed easier. He tried again. He got up a little higher, slipped again, but he came at it once more, and this time he was careful. He got gradually higher and higher, and my spirits went down more and more. Up he came an inch at a time with his eyes hot, his tongue hanging out, and higher, hitched his foot over the stump of a limb and looked up as much as to say, you are my meat, friend. Up again, higher and higher, and getting more excited the closer he got. He was within 10 feet of me. I took a long breath, and then said I, it is now or never. I had the coil of the lariat already. I paid it out slowly till it hung right over his head. All of a sudden, I let go of the slack, and the slip noose fell fairly round his neck, quicker than lightning. I, out with the Allen, let him have it in the face. It was an awful roar, must have scared the bull out of his senses. When the smoke cleared away, there he was, dangling in the air, 20 foot from the ground, and going out of one convulsion into another faster than you could count. I didn't stop to count anyhow. I shined down that tree and shot for home. Bemis, is all that true, just as you have stated it? I wish I may rot in my tracks and die the death of a dog if it isn't. Well, we can't refuse to believe it, and we don't. But if there were some proofs? Did I bring back my lariat? No. Did I bring back my horse? No. Did you ever see the bull again? No. Well, then what more do you want? I never saw anybody as particular as you are about a little thing like that. I made up my mind that if this man was not a liar, he only missed it by the skin of his teeth. era of that kind of storytelling is probably long gone. Don't get me wrong, people will still tell stories, and leaders will still tell stories, but that idea of the fast-paced, long-winded, full of detail story that has a punchline at the end that gently pokes fun at regionalism and at truth all in the same time has probably moved on, as it did in the course of the 20th century, from radio to television to movies. Alexander Payne films are now most notable for having that sort of regional, sense of humor, but without the Mark Twain level pacing, and has now moved into the past. That kind of humor doesn't survive the algorithm, right? It can't be flattened by the wants or the desires of the social media platforms or the need for clicks. Don't get me wrong, people will still tell humorous stories. I mean, this is the provenance of stand-up comedians, right? But every stand-up comedian worth his salt, or her salt, is now trying to get their clips to go viral online as quickly as they possibly can. Ari Spears, Dave Chappelle, and many others. This skill set that Twain put forth, the ability to channel a voice, a cadence, a speed of humor that would get across a much larger point about truth and lies, let's be honest, is now past. And the era that it sat at the beginning of, which was an era that began at the beginning of the 20th century, has now, 20 years into the 21st century, probably officially come to a close. The Conestoga wagon, of course, has now been replaced by the Tesla electric car, but the impulse in Americans to tell a story, just like the impulse exists in any other human beings, remains the same. But it's how the humor is going to come about. See, at least once a year on this podcast, sometimes twice, we have to stand up for comedians, right? We have to stand up for comedy. And this kind of gives me an opportunity to do this. And so, I always say, leave the comedians alone, right? Stop policing the language. I think we moved on from that, partially because of the efforts of comedians like Dave Chappelle, who received the Mark Twain Award for Humor, I believe a couple of years ago. By the way, a man who made a lot of humor and lived through a horrific civil war about race, right? That award was given to a man who made jokes about people's identity. We have to stand up for the comedians, right? We have to stand up for the people that can leverage their free speech and do leverage their free speech in order to tell a joke. And leaders, you have to stand up for the people who are funny on your team. When we deracinate or desalinate or desaturate, whatever D you'd like to use, when we take away the power of humor from people, particularly in workplace environments, and we say that it all has to be serious and or even has to be approved corporate funny, which of course everyone knows is just not funny. When it has to be that, well, then what we're doing is we're robbing people of their humanity. We're robbing people of their ability to experience tension. There's another thing that's reflected in that story, and it is a minority report, but it is still there. That is the tension between the skepticism of the city and the otherworldliness of the country. And people are experiencing that tension right now as we live in a pre-pandemic world, or sorry, not pre-pandemic, post-pandemic world, where people have moved around. And there's a lot of difference between a 500 square foot apartment in San Francisco and a 2,500 square foot house on 2 acres of land in Kansas. Your neighbors are different. That's the big thing. See, we have hit a bump in our time where we don't really know our neighbors and we don't really know ourselves. And the solution to this is indeed a spiritual solution, because of course it's a pre-modern problem in a postmodern time that requires a pre-modern solution. And part of the spiritual solution lies in not only laughing at your neighbors, but using laughter with your neighbors and hearing their tall tales to unite you together around a common foe. Whatever foe that may happen to be. Back to the book, back to Roughing It. We're still early in the book, grabbing leadership lessons from it, and we're going to go to chapter 5. We're going to meet an interesting animal here. The coyote is a long, slim, sick, and sorry-looking skeleton with a gray wolf skin stretched over it, a tolerably bushy tail that forever sags down with a despairing expression of forsakenness and misery, a furtive and evil eye, and long, sharp face with slightly lifted lip and exposed teeth. He has a general slinking expression all over. The coyote is a living, breathing allegory of want. He is always hungry. He is always poor, out of luck, and friendless. The meanest creatures despise him, and even the fleas would desert him for a velocipede. He is so spiritless and cowardly that even while his exposed teeth are pretending a threat, the rest of his face is apologizing for it. And he is so homely, so scrawny and ribby and coarse-haired and pitiful. When he sees you, he lifts up his lip and lets out a flash of his teeth out, and then turns a little out of the course he was pursuing, depresses his head a bit, and strikes a long, soft-footed trot through the sagebrush, glancing over his shoulder at you from time to time till he is about out of easy pistol range, and then he stops and takes a deliberate survey of you. He will trot 50 yards and stop again, another 50 and stop again, and finally the gray of his gliding body blends with the gray of the sagebrush, and he disappears. All this is when you make no demonstration against him, but if you do, he develops a livelier interest in his journey and instantly electrifies his heels and puts such a deal of real estate between himself and your weapon that by the time you have raised the hammer, you see that you need a mini rifle, and by the time you have got him in line, you need a rifled cannon, and by the time you have drawn a bead on him, you see well enough that nothing but an unusually long-winded streak of lightning could reach him where he is now. But if you start a swift-footed dog after him, you will enjoy it ever so much, especially if it is a dog that has a good opinion of himself and has been brought up to think he knows something about speed. The coyote will go swinging gently off on that deceitful trot of his, and every little while he will smile a fraudful smile over his shoulder that would fill that dog entirely full of encouragement and worldly ambition, and make him lay his head still lower on the ground, and stretch his neck further to the front and pant more fiercely and stick out his tail straighter behind and move his furious legs with a yet wilder frenzy and leave a broader and higher and denser cloud of desert sand smoking behind and marking his long wake across the level plain. And all this time the dog is only a short 20 feet behind the coyote, and to save the soul of him, he cannot understand why it is that he cannot get perceptibly closer. And he begins to get aggravated, and it makes him madder and madder to see how gently the coyote glides along and never pants or sweats or ceases to smile. And he grows still more and more incensed to see how shamefully he has been taken in by an entire stranger, and what an ignoble swindle that long, calm, soft-footed trot is. And next, he notices that he is getting fagged and that the coyote actually has to slacken speed a little to keep from running away from him. And then that town dog is mad in earnest, and he begins to strain and weep and swear and paw the sand higher than ever and reach for the coyote with concentrated and desperate energy. This spurt finds him 6 feet behind the gliding enemy and 2 miles from his friends. And then, in the instant that a wild new hope is lighting up his face, the coyote turns and smiles blandly upon him once more, and with a something about it which seems to say, well, I shall have to tear myself away from you, bub. Business is business, and it will not do for me to be fooling along this way all day. And forthwith there is a rushing sound, and the sudden splitting of a long crack through the atmosphere. And behold, that dog is solitary and alone in the midst of a vast solitude. So that bit there about the coyote puts me in mind of Looney Tunes, actually, and the travails of Wile E. Coyote. A person who, well, not a person, an animal who was constantly chasing the Roadrunner, getting material and tools from the worst possible company on the planet, Acme. And, of course, the tools never worked. The schemes never worked. But Wile E. Coyote is emblematic of America, right? Trapped out in the wild frontier, ordering tools and innovations from folks back east who have zero clue what's actually happening out there in the West, and then utilizing those tools and those schemes and those ideas and attempting to mold them into catching the one thing he can never actually get, the Roadrunner. The Roadrunner cartoons are, like I said, an allegory of American innovation and excellence. They are representative of the American ideal that if I just put enough elbow grease to something, dadgummit, this is going to work. And Mark Twain would have appreciated Wile E. Coyote, his want, his schemes, his inability to take no for an answer. He would have also appreciated the Roadrunner, constantly running away, constantly dodging, constantly seeing through the schemes and the motives, and sticking out his tongue and saying, beep, beep. That's representative of the frontier. And where is the frontier when everything has already been explored? See, if you go to people right now and you ask them about the frontier, if you ask them, where is the frontier in America? Where is the place of the next exploration? People will, in general, not understand the assignment. They won't understand the question. Because, in general, when people think about it, which is rare, they don't think too much about the frontier. Because we've been captured by postmodern thinking. And postmodern thinking around cultural confidence, around humility, historical guilt, and material wealth cannot solve the pre-modern problem of needing to have a frontier, needing to have a boundary to push and to explore. This is a thing that is driven by ancient human tendencies that the postmodern mind doesn't understand. The nature of want, desire, poverty, both material and spiritual, cannot be addressed accurately unless pre-modern language and religiously minded appeals are leveraged. In essence, you need a coyote to catch a roadrunner, but when you've tamed the coyote and turned him into a town dog, he can't get that roadrunner. The frontiers of the postmodern West, and there are frontiers, don't get me wrong, particularly as this West is framed in an American context, are going to be frontiers that exist inside the behaviors of people that are not optimized for quote-unquote success. Look, the frontiers exist, but they exist in all of us as individuals now. We're long past an era of mass culture, mass movements, mass communication. I say this repeatedly on this podcast. Actually, that's the reason this podcast even exists, is because we're at the end of Mass, which means the frontier is inside of us as individuals. It is inside of our behaviors. And if we've never critically thought about what's inside of us, well, we'll be constantly chasing it like a coyote chasing a roadrunner. And our frontier will look back at us, stick out its tongue, and yell beep beep. It is critical for us to access and understand the realities of human behavior, driven by pre-modern wants and desires, and also these behaviors, and to understand that these behaviors are driven by a rejection of postmodern, secularist, non-triumphant thinking. In essence, we need our frontier to motivate us to do something different and to do something new. Without that, roughing it just reads like an anachronism from another time that you can put on a shelf and safely forget the lessons from, even if you ever understood them in the first place. So as we close out our podcast episode today, a short one, of course, as we sometimes do, we are approaching the holiday season in North America. If you're listening to this, you're on the other side of Thanksgiving and on your way to Christmas, and so I want to give you an opportunity to think about a couple of different things here with Mark Twain and with Roughing It before we turn the corner and go into our Christmas schedule and our Christmas books, which include The Burglar's Christmas by Willa Cather, of course, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and a couple of other surprises that we have for you coming up before the end of the year. So what can leaders learn from Roughing It? Right? What can leaders learn even from just reading the first few chapters of Mark Twain's great travel log, written by a humorist, a satirist, and probably something that should be taken with a grain of salt, right? Well, the first thing that leaders need to learn is that Mark Twain's insights about the frontier frame the future, and leaders want to use those insights to frame the future. As I just mentioned with Wile E. Coyote and him standing in as an allegory of American innovation, leaders need to be wild. They need to be hungry. They need to be like coyotes, right? Coyotes specifically chasing roadrunners, right? Now, there's a time to be the coyote, but there's also for leaders a time to be the roadrunner. And knowing the distinction with the difference is critical for leadership success. The other thing that leaders need to do and that we can take from Roughing It and from its subsequent fading in Mark Twain's canon, but also fading in the literary canon, is that leaders need to wrestle with the confusion generated by a lack of cultural confidence that exists now in America and that may have filtered down, actually has filtered down, to their own teams and to individuals. Look, people are struggling with confidence right now. Confidence in leaders, confidence in systems, confidence in institutions, confidence in structures. This confidence, this lack of confidence can be shored up. It can be ameliorated through efforts of intentional leadership. And if we're not intentionally doing that, then we really are roughing it. We really are kind of going at it with hammer and tongs, but without a plan. Leaders need humor to deal with the vagaries of change. Look, we don't like to talk a lot about humor, and if you tell a joke these days that's a little off color, you could probably wind up losing your job. But the fact of the matter is, you need human beings to be humorous because that gives us humanity. And human beings are going to see the humor in situations. And so leaders need to harness that and be honest with that. You know, when things are funny, they're funny. When funny situations or funny circumstances occur, they may require a laugh. But there's also going to be times when they don't require a laugh. So, for instance, I remember a scene from The Sopranos when one mob boss went to another mob boss because, some mobster that they both knew had made a joke about mob boss, the mob boss B's wife, right? And mob boss A listened to the joke, didn't change expression at all, right? And generated a solution to the problem. Now, that didn't satisfy mob boss B, whose wife had been besmirched by the joke, but it was well within the rules of mafioso, and it was well within the rules of the hierarchy. That's an example of leaders not laughing at the joke, but instead making a decision while also recognizing that the joke was funny. By the way, in that particular scene, I believe it was in The Sopranos, in that particular scene, I believe that, the mob boss was asked, did you get the joke? And the guy was like, he deadpans and he goes, yeah, I did. I got it. It's fine. That's sometimes the appropriate response to humor is just the deadpan. Oh, yeah, I got it. It's fine. Here's the decision. Mark Twain would appreciate that, right? He would also appreciate letting your hair down and having a laugh ever so often. Everything isn't the end of the world. Everything isn't all that serious. Finally, leaders need to see, and this is kind of the point of our podcast overall this year, they need to see and take action on the new frontiers that exist inside of people's behavior. Look, we have a lot of innovations that are running at us very quickly in the technological end, as they have been for the last 30 years. And it seems as though technology is leading culture down a dangerous path. But human behavior hasn't fundamentally changed in 30 years, and it won't fundamentally change 30 years from now. So where are those new frontiers in human behavior, and how do we communicate getting our teams to them? This requires emotional intelligence. This requires conflict management. This requires being able to adapt to change and being able to negotiate with difficult people. But it also requires an acknowledgement and an understanding that the frontier is not out there, although it may geographically be out there. But the bigger frontier is geographically inside each one of your people. It's inside of your teams. It's inside of your organizations, your institutions, and your structures. Pack up your Conestoga wagon and head out west. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.